Okay, nice small intimate group. So
Yeah.
yeah, let's make this as much of a conversation as we can. And so we really have a nice group of people who are going to be participating in these 3 days of workshops. So I introduced myself already. Eugenia introduced herself already. We're going to be joined by Sally, who is the person who is in the trenches at USC in regards to getting everything done. And so our goal here is to try to look at providing candidate support through a variety of different lenses, and to try as much as possible to be responsive to to what people feel they need in the field. So today, what we really wanted to talk about is going back to this idea of why do we do the EdTPA? What is it that we're really trying to accomplish? And what are some of the things that we can do to actually make that happen? So we're looking at 3 things today. The first one is coaching practices that reduce stress. The second is differentiating support to reduce stress. And then an overview of the EdTPA and how we're going to move forward. And because we have such a small group, please chime in with questions at any point in time. And in regards to anything that is being triggered by our conversation. And Eugenia and I are going to be somewhat flexible as well. Eugenia is just going to jump in whenever she feels something that she has something important to add. So one of the things that I wanted to start out with here is just this phrase. Our students often come to us saying, I need help, not more insanity. And one of the things that strikes me as I've worked with with teacher prep over the decades is this neat little phrase. It's our job as teacher educators to fill up our students' metaphorical teacher tool chest. We have to give them as many strategies as we possibly can so that they're ready to go into the classroom. Now, whenever I hear that phrase, I'm brought back to the early 1980s when I got married. And I got married in a very, very traditional community with very, very defined and traditional gender roles. So when I was, when I first got married, people started buying me tools. And I very quickly filled up my tool chest with, screwdrivers and hammers and wrenches. And you know what? I don't know how to use any of those tools. And the more tools people bought me, the more I had to find place to let them sit and rust. And that actually propelled me at one point in time to really begin to do some research into what makes somebody an expert. And it's really very fascinating when we look at the literature on expertise, because an expert doesn't know more, an expert knows when and how. And, as we look at it, our candidates are actually better served if they have like 10 tools that they have a very deep understanding of, instead of having 30 tools that they only have a superficial understanding of. And one of the things about the EdTPA is that it actually is pushing candidates to get that deeper level of thinking. So our emphasis here is trying to tell our candidates 10 more things they can do is insanity. Now, the other thing that begins to happen is I often have these conversations with people when they're working with the TPA. I'll be sitting in a meeting and somebody will say, our students need to do a better job lesson planning. Does anybody have a lesson plan template that will, almost guarantee that they're going to pass the TPA? And I'm one of these people that begin to push these questions. My first question is, well, before we talk about lesson plan templates, let's ask this question. Are your candidates failing lesson planning in their methods classes? And everybody will say, oh no, our candidates are creating these beautiful lesson plans in their methods classes. And I'm going, okay. And then I go, well, so is this the problem? are your candidates incapable of teaching a lesson when they're in their student teaching placement? And they'll say, oh no, our candidates are doing a wonderful job teaching lessons, and the students are engaged and the students are learning. And then I'll sit here and I'm saying, okay, so the problem isn't lesson planning. Because if they know how to do lesson plans and methods classes, and they know how to do lesson planning when they're student teaching, then they know how to lesson plan. The problem is transferring those skills into the edTPA. So creating a new template isn't going to solve anything. So when we take a step back and we begin to realize that in many instances, we're not really grasping what the students need, we need to begin to take a different lens. And so one thing that we have to begin to really deal with is the elephant in the room. Our candidates are under enormous stress when they're in the student teaching semester. They feel like they are constantly being evaluated. Every day their master teacher is telling them, you did this well, or you did that bad. And under this environment with COVID, the teachers are under stress. And I just hear all kinds of, crazy stories about how that's playing out. I've seen, I also do a lot of BIR accreditation visits around the state. And the number of assignments that universities pack into student teaching, like huge reflection journals, excessive lesson planning templates, disposition forms, and you can just look around the list. Our candidates are overwhelmed. Now, if we go back to the work from Sylvester and Goldman in the late 80s and early 90s related to emotional intelligence, one of the things that begins to emerge is that our candidates are oftentimes in a state of what Goldman and Sylvester talked about as emotional hijacking. They're trying to be in charge of everything, so they're not even allowing themselves to begin to say, I'm overwhelmed. And so all of these emotions are at the subconscious level, which are directing what they see, what they perceive, what they do. But because it's at the unconscious level, they're not able to manage them. So in many instances, when our students are saying, I need more help, what they're really saying is, I'm overwhelmed. And if all we do when we help them is give them more of the strategies, more of the templates to fill out, we're actually adding more burden to their unconscious emotions. So with this as a preface, I began to ask this question: how can we change how we coach students during their clinical experiences in a way that would actually reduce their stress? So the first thing that I began to look at is, what is it that we expect university supervisors to do during the student teaching semester? And as we look at it, we begin to realize that our supervisors and our edTPA coordinators are oftentimes under this this tension. They really don't know what their role is. There is this sense that I'm an assessor. I have to make sure that every one of my student teachers is demonstrating mastery in the TPEs. I've got to verify that they have these dispositions that are consistent with being a professional. And so my job is to evaluate them and to see that they are growing in a way that I can produce data. But on the opposite end of that spectrum, they're saying, but you know what, I also am an encourager. I need to affirm their strengths. I need to nurture a growth mindset. I need to be this person here who is this positive light in their life. And so, where along that spectrum do you fall? And supervisors sometimes are confused. The other tension that they have is, in many instances, is, am I a teacher? Is my job am I responsible for linking the content that of the edTPA, the content that they're teaching in the classroom, the lesson plans that they're using? Am I responsible for linking that to their methods courses? Am I responsible for giving them more tools to use in their tool chest? Is my job to teach them how to be a better teacher? On the opposite end of that spectrum is this idea of, am I a colleague? Is my job here to, encourage inquiry, to share that, to provide space for them to share their personal story, to walk alongside of them as an equal. And so as we look at this idea of being a supervisor, we realize that it's really not a very simple a role to define. So as we look at this, we begin to realize that we can put these spectrums into a grid matrix with the y-axis being the spectrum from encourager to assessor, and the x-axis being the spectrum from colleague to teacher. Now, as we unpack this grid matrix, we realize that there's really 4 roles that we want our supervisors to play during clinical experiences. The first role is that of an expert. And this is where I'm teaching them, what it means to be a good educator, and I'm assessing them in relationship to the TPEs. And we have become an expert in doing this. And it is rare that I find that I'll interact with a university supervisor or a master teacher that is not very proficient in this role. Now, this role, though, is the one that creates the most stress, because this is the one where you're always getting judged. Now, the 3 other parts of the grid matrix are things where I think that we are underutilizing what we can do to support our candidates. And that is a facilitator of learning, a nurturer of agency, and a planner of activities. And so the question becomes, what if we began to emphasize these 3 quadrants with more intentionality? How would that impact the emotions of the candidate? And how could that be coordinated into giving them more confidence in working with the edTPA? So the first thing I want to look at is this idea of co-planning. And as we look at this idea of co-planning, I'm using the research related to lesson studies. And one of the keys to a lesson study is helping people dig deeper into what's going on in the classroom. And the problem with fully embracing the lesson study idea is that our master teachers may not know how to engage in a lesson study. And quite honestly, they oftentimes don't have time or a school structure to make that happen. But if you look at this and say, how could I actually take these principles of lesson study and embed them into an activity study? What might happen? So one of my favorite activities as an educator is pair share. And, as I begin to think about this idea of pair share, it seems so incredibly simple. My students are confused. I say, talk to your neighbor. 30 seconds later, I say, okay, let's debrief. And, on first thoughts, that's what we all think about with pair share. But now let's do kind of a variation of a lesson study with pair share. So the first thing I want to talk about as we do this lesson study with pair share is, when are you using pair share? So let's look at your lesson plan. Where do you think students will need a mind break where they get to process the information? Now, when the students get to this point of the mind break, what's a good question to ask and what's a weak question to ask? So notice how when I'm beginning to engage in this study of this activity of something as simple as pair share, I'm actually engaged in all of the elements of lesson planning. Then the next question is, now the question becomes, okay, now that I know where I'm going to use pair share, how am I going to group my students? And when I group my students in this way, how much time am I going to give them? How am I going to monitor this activity while it's going on? How will I know that the activity has reached its end? How am I going to pull everybody's attention back up front? So notice now I'm doing all of the conversations about classroom management. Now, the next conversation I have is, okay, during debriefing, how am I going to handle debriefing? So one of the things I learned by accident is that I always would, that this phrase is the most powerful. Eugenia, what were you and Raina discussing? And it's really funny because whenever you use that phrase, the first thing out of Eugenia's mouth is, well, Raina was saying. Now, if you look at that, Eugenia just threw Raina under the bus, because if the answer is stupid, it's not Eugenia's fault, it's Raina's fault. But you know what? that's really important because that reduces the emotional stress of a person when they're sharing. And it creates a better classroom environment. Now, the next thing that you begin to then say is, what if Raina immediately jumps in and begins to say, well, actually what I was saying, well, this is another classroom management thing, because if I let Raina jump in and talk, then Eugenia has an excuse to not talk. So notice how I'm now beginning to create engagement here, because I have to call on a certain person, I have to make them talk, and I have to do this in a safe environment. So we're beginning to talk about more classroom management. We're talking about student engagement, and we're beginning to talk about, how do we assess learning? Now, also in regards to debriefing with a pair share activity, you begin to deal with things like, when do I call on the brightest student? When do I call on the student who is struggling? How many students do I call on? How do I respond to what they share? Do I paraphrase what they say, or do I just hit the high points? So notice how we have all of this assessment and differentiation and student engagement going on during the share part of this activity. And then, once I'm all done, how do I adjust my lesson accordingly? And so notice how when I unpack that very simple activity of pair share, I'm actually keying in on every TPE that I have to assess. And more important, notice as I'm unpacking this pair share activity, I'm actually doing the EdTPA cycle. And what's really powerful about focusing just on an activity and using the lesson study elements with it is that I can now, the next time I observe the student, it's very easy for this student to use pair share again. And we can debrief it some more. And we can dig into it a little bit deeper, and we can give the student even a little bit more expertise. And so I'm now systematically helping the student or the teacher candidate understand this process of the EdTPA pattern of assess, evaluate, plan, implement, and assess. And so I'm developing this thought process, which is part of the EdTPA, in a way that is helping the candidate begin to realize, oh yeah, this gives me more confidence. This helps me, really improve my instruction. And that leads into the second element here during clinical practice, which is nurturing agency. And in this area of nurturing agency, I'm building on Cortagan's work of core value reflection. And in essence, and this is a very simplified explanation of Cortagan, but he talks about this elevator. And this elevator is think, feel, and wish. And so, what Cortagan says is that we start out our debriefing with our students with this simple phrase: what do you think happened? And we wait for the student to kind of articulate, what their thoughts are. So candidate might say, oh, I think that this lesson went really well, but I was a little bit disappointed that Eugenia never let Raina talk. And, and as soon as the candidate identifies something that they're less than happy with, I want to stop the thinking phrase. And then I want to begin to ask the candidate, well, how did that make you feel? And we're really trying to get to the emotions of the candidate. And we don't want, I think that this makes me feel sad. We actually want the candidate to say, I feel sad. Well, what does sad feel like? Why are you sad? Now, as the candidate is sharing this, I'm listening carefully to try to begin to find some of their core values. So I might find values such as, oh, wow, you're very sensitive, or wow, you're goal-directed, or you're very open-minded, or you're analytical. Because once I find that core value, I can begin to encourage the candidate by saying, wow, that core value really is something that helps you be committed to making the student, making your classroom better. And that's when I can begin to go into the wish phrase. Well, what do you wish was happening in your classroom? And then I can begin to say, well, based on that, how could you use your core value to make this wish materialize? Now, as you look at this idea of nurturing agency and co-planning, the two can begin to overlap as a Venn diagram. Because now I can begin to say, well, now, how could we use, and I'm just going to stick with pair share, how could we use the pair share activity to help you encourage the student who is very shy and that you're very, that you're very nervous about embarrassing. And I'm now using the candidate's own sense of agency, their own sense of vocational vision within lesson planning to actually practice the EdTPA cycle of, assess, evaluate the data, use that to plan, implement, and assess. And so this thinking, this systematic thinking that we are trying to develop within our candidates is now becoming a major focus of our coaching activities. And then that leads into the third quadrant area that I wanted to emphasize, which is facilitating growth. And here I'm using the work of Darling Hammond, and I'm using the work of Mark Swartz. And in particular, what I'm emphasizing in this particular area is for the supervisor to realize that they are an expert, that they have this level of expertise, and it's their job to use that expertise to facilitate and guide the candidate. In particular, Mark Swartz talks about this idea that learning begins when people can sense what is currently invisible to them. And Swartz will talk about using the candidate's senses to make visible what is currently invisible. So, we begin to say, when you were using that pair share activity, did you happen to notice what Tracy was doing during this session? No, I wasn't looking at her at all. Well, if we did a video observation, we could say, okay, well, let's look at the video and now let's focus specifically on Tracy. And, why do you think that was happening? Now, notice how I'm going to, after I made Tracy's behavior visible, I'm going back to the think, feel, wish. And once I go back to the think, feel, wish, then I can go back into the co-planning with the activity. So the key here within coaching is we can actually coach in a way that mimics the EdTPA cycle and builds this sense of confidence within the candidate because they're consistently doing this in a way that makes sense to them and helps them improve. And this actually goes back to an article from Hattie that often does not show up with a lot of Hattie fans. And in this particular article, Hattie will acknowledge that we have done a remarkable job in emphasizing the skills that we want learners to achieve. And we, all of Hattie's meta-analyses focus on different skills and how different, different learning activities, either enhance or minimally enhance skills. In this article, though, Hattie says we've got to be aware of the fact that if all we focus on is skills, we're going to destroy a person's love of learning. And, if we begin to look at the EdTPA, if all we do is focus on the prompts that need to be covered, if all we focus on is the tools that you need to use, we're going to kill the joy of the person's learning, and they're going to begin to shut down with these unconscious emotions. And what Hattie talks about in this article is how we need to focus more on will and thrill. And will is this intrinsic conviction that drives somebody to keep on saying, how can I improve? How can I get better? And by looking at this coaching cycle that we just quickly went over, you can begin to see that really builds the spirit of inquiry. What's going on? How can I improve? How can I get better? And more than that, it also begins to emphasize the thrill of learning, which is this discovery that resiliency and success is fun. And when the student, when the candidate is able to see themselves begin to advance in their abilities, they begin to say, wow, I have the capability of doing this. So, as we look at this, we're going back to the heart of what the EdTPA was, what all of the TPAs were all about, and in particular, what the EdTPA, which is all about, which is helping the candidate develop the thinking dispositions of a professional. And we're downplaying the emphasis on helping the candidates pass the edTPA, and instead we're focusing on helping the candidates grow in these skills.
Yeah.
So before we go on to the next question,
Yeah, and I'd love
the next
to
session,
add,
any questions or any comments?
yeah, I want to add to that, Keith, because I think, this to me really captures where we're trying to move in terms of what the edTPA really is about. I think we do get caught up in the prompts, answer prompt, answer prompt, answer prompt, and the students start to lose sight of, why am I doing that? They're just doing the mechanics of, I need to make sure I answer every one of these prompts and fill in this and follow this handbook that says no more than 4 pages on a lesson plan, no more than this. But what this is capturing, and the connections that I'm making, is the teaching and learning process. That the hope is they don't see this as a test to pass, but an instructional process that will guide the way I continue to plan and implement and assess and engage with my students in ways that I'm more thoughtful about it in terms of the processes I go through as a teacher in thinking about what I'm doing in the classroom and how I'm implementing. So this is a real powerful piece for me. And I see that Dana also commented in the chat, the will and the thrill, loving that kind of piece of it, because the will and thrill will lead to possible replication and ongoing use of the process, as opposed to pass the test at TPA, I passed it, I got my score. That's not what the intent of it is, but it's this will and thrill connected to the skill that could lead to ongoing implementation.
Any other comments or questions?
I think it's also, Eugenia, with what you said, it's also important to help the candidates see that as they move from being a pre-service teacher into the field as a new teacher, that some of these concepts will return in their induction process. And so, helping them see how this is helping them build a foundation for teaching in the future will help them do better as they move from our programs where they have a lot of structure to when they're out in the field as a teacher of record feeling at a loss because they're no longer there. We're no longer there to facilitate that experience.
Yeah, Raina, you really highlight something that strikes me, which is, if I was a basketball coach, our practice is where we are coaching the particular skills that they're going to use, that they're going to need during the game. And if we don't look at the TPEs within the context of the teaching learning cycle, then we're not coaching them to be successful in the game. And so this is really kind of what we are articulating here, is to make our coaching more consistent with the game. And this isn't just the edTPA, this is professional thinking. So not seeing anything else, let's go on here. So now the next thing that we begin to look at is, and I've really been trying to push to humanize our candidates' experience. So the first part is coaching so that they're ready to play the game. Success in practice is going to bring about success in the game. But now they have to actually complete the edTPA. And this is a high stakes test. It is going to create stress. And that's going to once again create these unconscious emotions where the candidate is beginning to say, I can't do this. So let's look a little bit more about how I can differentiate support to help the candidates. Well, the first thing I want to highlight here is that all of our candidates have a preferred perspective. And we have the candidates, and who are detailed oriented. Man, do they love to get down into the mud. They want to look at every single question on the TPA. They want to talk about every question within the TPA, and usually they're the most vocal people in our edTPA sessions. And if I look at it, well, first off, I will be upfront. I am not a detailed person. These detailed questions drive me nuts and they overwhelm me. So, I do have a negative bias towards these detailed people. But you know what, as I've looked at these detailed people over the course of my career, they're usually the ones that are high stress but low need. They're going to pass this thing because they are so detailed oriented. The people who struggle are often the people like me who want the big picture. And they're sitting up here and telling me, why do I need to do this? And what's really interesting is that if you look at the EdTPA handbooks, they have the big picture with the graphic organizer, but then the big picture disappears. And you've got rubrics with all of these words, and you've got you've got the templates with all of these words. And if you're a big picture person like me, most of the support that's out there just creates more stress. And telling me more is not going to help me more. Telling me more is going to shut me down more. And if we begin to look at this, it would be interesting to figure out how many candidates who prefer the big picture are passing on the first attempt versus how many candidates who love the mud are passing on the first attempt. And that just would be a very interesting study. But, we're in a world where if we're differentiating, we should really be providing both and. So how can we provide more big picture support is one of the things that I've been thinking about. The second thing is, and I just quickly went through the EdTPA, and I just looked for all of the writing skills words that were used in the different prompts. And so you'll see words like analyze, justify, describe, write a commentary, cite evidence, provide concrete examples. And, this should not be a huge surprise. This is academic language. And the question is, do our candidates really understand the difference between writing a concrete example and citing evidence? Or is that in and of itself, causing somebody to shut down? So I was sharing with Eugenia during our planning session about my dissertation journey. And I think with the way that my dissertation was, I think it was chapter 3, where I had to analyze and then synthesize. And I got to that part in my dissertation, and I'm not a dumb person. I was sitting on a 4.0 at that particular time during my doctoral program. And I'm sitting here and I'm going, what in the world is the difference between an analysis and a synthesis? And I was so incredibly embarrassed that here I am at the end of my doctoral program and I don't know the difference. So I didn't have the courage to ask anyone. And I can remember spending over an hour in the dictionary trying to figure out the difference. Finally came up with something that made sense to me, wrote it up, submitted it to my chair, and I'm looking in pure horror because I'm going, I don't think I did this right. And my chair says, wow, this is the best analysis and synthesis section I've seen in years. And kind of the moral of the story is, here is a person at the end of a doctoral program, or actually based on my chair's comment, how many people at the end of the doctoral program still don't know the difference between an analysis and a synthesis? Is it any surprise that our candidates might be struggling with these two types of writing styles? And the question is, are we actually giving our candidates explicit examples of how to write a concrete example or how to cite evidence? So can our candidates actually getting the support they need in these different writing styles? Then the next thing I looked at is task language. And so this is language within the field of education. And when you look at the language within the field of education, look at all of these different things that we're asking candidates to do. What is direct evidence? What is the content domain? What's the learning task? What are the personal, cultural, and community assets? And the list goes on and on and on. Now, the EdTPA does a great job of providing a glossary, but the glossary is all words. And the glossary oftentimes is using more words that the candidate may never hear, kind of going back to my analysis and synthesis example. When I look at the glossary, sometimes I need the dictionary to actually unpack words to make sense of what's going on. And our candidates are stressed and they're just looking at this in many instances and saying, I think I know what needs to happen, and they do it. And they may go to the glossary, or if they're like my students, they may go to Google, which is really going to take them in the wrong direction. But just think about how much academic language is within the edTPA itself. And the question is, how much support are we giving for our candidates who are struggling with this language? Because one of the reasons they may struggle with passing is the language, not necessarily the skill level. And then I go to the last area here, which is this idea of context of placement. So our candidates are doing the edTPA as a guest in a teacher's classroom. And our candidates all have a vision of what they think a great classroom will be. And that vision is going to include pedagogical preferences. And the candidate may have this vision of, I want to be this really dynamic lecturer. And it's possible to pass the edTPA if you're a dynamic lecturer. But they may be in a classroom that focuses on learning centers. And so now this candidate is trying to envision what learning centers are like, and they don't really buy into learning centers because they're a lecturer, and now they have to do this edTPA in this environment that they don't understand and they don't really agree with. Or their pedagogical practices may be small groups. So, our candidates in many instances need help unpacking a way of learning that is not necessarily what they have experienced throughout their life and what they envision. The other thing we look at in regards to context is the relationships. Some of our candidates are in this wonderful environment where all of the teachers get along, all of the teachers are sharing with each other, all of the teachers are bouncing ideas off from each other, and they're going to have a lot less, and that could be a positive or a negative, because all of the teachers could hate standardized assessment and actually fuel the candidate's frustration with having to do the edTPA, or these great relationships might actually be encouraging with all these teachers providing support. But some of our candidates are in these environments where teachers don't get along with each other and they're constantly arguing, and the teacher is trying to navigate that fear in addition to everything else. And then we've got, kind of the organization, which room is organized. Some of you might say, oh, you know what, I need this room where everything has its place. And some of you might actually be like me, where this absolutely perfectly organized room makes you nervous because you're scared to do anything because you might put it in the wrong place. And some of you might actually like this room better where everything is chaotic, because in the midst of chaos, you know what's going on. So kind of the key to this here is our students have this vocational vision that may or may not match the context that they're in. And one of the first things they need is to understand how that context is not good or bad, but different. And then what they need is help in understanding how to survive within that context. So if we begin to look at it, notice how there's 4 areas where our candidates may need different types of support. We've got we've got the first one in relationship to big picture, small picture. Then we've got writing styles. Then we've got language issues, and then we've got context of placements. And I love this book from Zhao that is entitled "Never Send a Human to Do a Machine's Job." And one of the things that I've seen many programs do with just great intentions is to create these edTPA workshops or these edTPA work days. But the problem that ends up happening that I often see is in these workshops or within these work days, there's only one style that's being presented. And it might be a writer's workshop with the assumption that everybody knows what's going on. So, notice how if that's what we're doing, we're not practicing what we preach. And so what I'm encouraging people to begin to think about is, how can we use technology as a supplement to actually supporting our candidates? And so I've been using more and more VoiceThread, the VoiceThread platform, as a way of creating support videos. And what I like about VoiceThread is that you can save it as at one slide at a time. And candidates can open it up and they can see all of the different slides that are there, and they can pick which slides they want to watch and which slides they want to ignore. And the other nice thing about VoiceThread is that it automatically goes to closed caption. So if, if a student has problem with hearing, they can read what you're saying there. And the other thing I like about VoiceThread is it allows people to do things at 2x. So if they want to listen to something really fast, they can. Now, within my VoiceThread videos, I begin to organize things like big picture. And I have slides that just talk about big picture. Then I have slides that just talk about different styles of writing that is needed. Then I have slides that deal with, the academic language. And then I have slides that deal with context. So I can now actually begin to create these presentations with this differentiated support. And my job as an instructor now is to guide my students towards the slides that they think will work best for their preferences. And my job then is to also go back to the coaching practices to help my candidates understand what they're already doing. So the key here that in this section is this idea that we need to think more about how do we differentiate support for the candidates we're working with, given all of these different issues related to learning. So this is the end of the second section. Comments, thoughts, questions?
I'm looking at the chat. I think one of my comments and something I mentioned to Keith early on, I didn't want to interrupt as you were going, Keith, but if you go back to the slide on the academic language part, Keith, really quick, I think one of the things that this also helps candidates with is being able to articulate what these skills mean, not just for themselves related to that TPA, but when they think about the transfer with their students in a classroom. What does it mean to analyze? How can I teach it if I don't know what it means, right? So the more that I become more familiar with the skills that I'm being asked to demonstrate and the distinction between them, like when you clearly said support versus citing evidence versus a concrete example, right? These are the same types of skills we are expecting teachers to teach children in classrooms and adolescents. So the better they can understand what they mean and distinguish them, in turn, it transfers to the ongoing implementation of this edTPA process for them. I mean, I keep coming back to the same thing, which is why I really appreciated, Keith, when we went through this in our planning sessions, is it really takes a step back to see how the edTPA can really serve a greater purpose than thinking I'm just passing a test. And so when you shared the academic language piece, it just reminded me of a lot of the work I do in schools with in-service teachers around literacy development. Actually, I just did this today with a couple of middle school teachers and saying, what does it mean to justify? What does it mean to cite evidence? How did you then teach that to your students? So I really love this piece too. I mean, everything I think has been super eye-opening and enlightening, but these are real strong connections I'm seeing with what directly transfers to the things that they do then. And what Reina mentioned, the movement from pre-service to in-service, and what our candidates will come to do with their own students. So this is a real powerful piece for me.
I appreciate, Keith, the slide on context of placement, because I actually, for the first time in over 2 years, went to go observe students this morning. And I was at 2 different schools thinking, oh my gosh, third grade can look so different at the same district, but across town at 2 very different schools. And so I think I will remind my students in the pre-service program that I see tonight that context of placement matters. And I think they worry so much about, I know that one of my students, for example, is at a high school where because of COVID, all the students are in a row and he wants to do more student group discussions and sit the students in groups. And I keep reminding them that this is the context that you have to work with and you have to make it work for you.
And it's possible to do good instruction in that environment. And it's one of the things that I think we oftentimes forget. We think that simply putting students in groups is going to make the learning better. And, I've seen that in edTPA responses too. And it's like, no, I've seen absolutely horrible group work where less learning is occurring and there's subtle hostility between students that actually is creating an emotionally unsafe environment. But if the candidate is, and I'll go back to Swartz's words here, the more that we kind of send this impression that there's some heuristic that's going to make learning magically happen, the more we are creating teachers who are not prepared for the realities of the context. So yeah, just excellent, excellent points. Okay, so the last section we're going to look at then is an overview of the edTPA and linking it to coaching and differentiation practices. And so the first thing I want to highlight here is I do love, absolutely love the edTPA graphic organizer. I'm a big picture person. I love this graphic organizer. However, there's something that I've noticed that often happens is that people transpose onto this graphic organizer a linear sequence. And the linear sequence is 1, I have to do step 1 planning. 2, I have to do step 2 instruction. 3, I have to do step 3 assessment. And what's really interesting about this is that that linear approach doesn't match the teaching learning cycle. And so, this goes back to, coaching the activity, which is we actually should start in step 4, and we should be practicing with our assessments, and we should coaching our candidates with the assessments so that they're actually beginning to gather good data on their students. And as they're gathering good data on their students, our candidates are beginning to understand what kind of assessments work in this class, what are the values of this assessment. And boy, now that my candidates understand, what is needed in the area of assessment, they can now actually go to step 1 and begin to do planning. And now once they plan something, as they plan it, they're going to begin to think about, well, what's this going to look like in my classroom, which is 2. And so now that they plan it and they think about what's in their classroom, they're actually going to implement it, which brings us back to 3. So the more we understand this as a cycle that's dynamic, the more that we can begin to once again emerge into what is good teaching. And we can get away from that test mentality of answer 1, answer 2, answer 3, answer 4. The next thing we have to look at is that if we're really preparing candidates, it's a system. It's not an individual endeavor. So our supervisors doing good coaching are going to help our candidates practice the thinking that we want them to develop. As they practice the thinking, our candidates are becoming more confident in what they need to do when they sit down with the edTPA. Number 2, we have to provide this idea of differentiation. We have to look at these different areas and we have to make sure there's support there for our candidates in each of these different areas. And as we're coaching, if I see my candidate is struggling in a particular area, I can now point my candidate to a differentiated tool that gives them the additional support that they need. And then the third thing we have to do is we have to keep on linking this back to our program, where we begin to say, oh, academic language, that was in our reading class. Oh, this type of reflective writing, that was in our ed psych class or whatever it is. So when we begin to realize that the edTPA is not just something that's added on at the end, but is actually this very dynamic approach to develop this type of thinking, we begin to realize that that the edTPA has the potential of becoming a tool for growth. Yes, it's still high stakes, but now it's not just a high stakes test hoop that I have to jump through, but it's a very valuable path in regards to developmental growth. So as we've envisioned our edTPA support sessions, we thought that the first one would really work on this idea of really understanding the essence of the edTPA and returning it back to a formative tool. And then we thought that session 2 would be where we look at the idea of backward planning. How can we use step 3 to prepare our candidates to complete step 1? And one of the things we're going to try to do within this presentation is to articulate how can we do some coaching to help our candidates in this phase? How can we then, what are some of the differentiation strategies we need to do in this phase? And then looking specifically at some of the prompts. So we're going to try to model what we've been talking about all night. And that session is on March 14. And then our third session is where we then look at now that we have this planning done, how do I implement this and evaluate it, which is step 2, and how do I complete step 3? And once again, we're going to try to follow our formatting in regards to here's how we could do some coaching to help in this area. Here's how we can do some differentiation to do, help in this area. And here's how we can, and here's some of the specific things to look for in the prompts. So that's our plan. Any insights or any requests, we are happy to make adjustments to our presentations to meet the needs that you feel your programs have.
Yeah, and so I do have a little very, very short 2-question Google Forms survey, so we can capture some of that feedback from you and from others. So I'm going to put the link into the chat pod, and we'll also post it with the presentation for tonight so that we can get more input from others as well as we plan for the next sessions. As Keith was saying, I think what we were hoping that really is unique about the way that we're approaching this is we didn't say like, these are what we're going to do. We're going to do this session, this session, and this session, but that it is about learning from our participants, just as we would want, as we practice what we preach, where we want teachers to learn from their students and then make that decision in terms of what's next. We wanted to do the same thing. So I will put the link in the chat, but I'll also be posting it. Well, I'll have them post it with the presentation too, so we can get more feedback, but I'll put that there for those of us who are here too. Let me put this right here. Okay, I'm putting that in there now. There it is. There's just 2 questions, like what support do you need and what would you be interested in terms of topic and content moving forward in these sessions? So kind of looking at what is some of the overarching support that is needed out there, and then what these sessions might offer in that niche of what you're interested in too. So very short.
And I think, Eugenia, we can actually stop the recording now.
Okay. All right, let me stop.